to make it appear that you are complying with the standards, but make sure you don't do anything that will prevent you from being able to meet the price that's being demanded for that product in that season. And this is the main reason why we have not seen broad sustainable progress in working conditions, because the market that the brands and retailers operate within their supply chains for apparel is a market that does not demand products made under good wages and conditions. It demands products that are sold at a price that can only be met by producing under what, generally speaking, it's fair to call sweatshop conditions. And so we've concluded, based on our experience, based on our understanding of the way supply chains operate, that something must be done about this problem of prices. Now, how do you solve this problem? How do you create a market from the perspective of producers for goods made under decent working conditions at decent wages? Oh, I had time.
Thank you.
Well, there are a number of ways you could do it. You could have public regulation. You could have trade rules at a global level. You could have rules governing importation at a domestic level that require that the brand or retailer importing the product establish that it's made under good conditions before you allow it to be imported. That's one thing you could do. That is not something that's being done by our government or any other government in importing countries, but it is in theory something that could be done. People may know that Senator Byron Dorgan has a bill which now has, I think, a dozen Senate co-sponsors and a companion bill in the House with over 200 House co-sponsors that would do this. That would essentially empower and require the U.S. Customs Service to prevent brands and retailers from importing goods made under sweatshop conditions. We could talk about the ins and outs of that bill, which is not likely to become law, by the way, anytime in the near future. But we have 200 House co-sponsors for a bill. It becomes a serious topic of discussion. We've gotten a number of calls about it from people we work with who represent brands who want to know whether we think, is this something that really might happen. Anyway, that's one thing you can do. You can also have private regulation. If there are institutions that are in a position to have some influence over, some clout with respect to brands and retailers, and universities are an example of this, they can, through private requirements, through private contractual requirements, ask the brands and retailers to meet a higher standard, to pay the price necessary to do so. As people may know, the Worker Rights Consortium, the United Students Against Sweatshops, have been promoting an idea called the Designated Suppliers Program, which at its core is simply a requirement that universities would impose on the brands to whom they license their logos, that they not pay their factories the price for their products so low that the only way the factory can possibly meet the price is to ignore university labor standards. We can talk about the status of that program, which is not going to be implemented in the short term. You can also generate additional, greater, more aggressive consumer pressure. The one thing we have seen, besides the private regulatory mechanisms that universities have adopted, the one thing we've seen that we know works to alter the behavior of brands and retailers is fear of damage to their brand reputation resulting from consumers developing the impression that they are a bad company that exploits workers and operates sweatshops. And the greater the pressure, the greater the fear on the part of the brand or retailer of that consequence, the more the brand or retailer will be willing to do in terms of changing actual practices. And there's been a certain level of pressure in recent years that's achieved certain things, but clearly there has not been enough pressure to get us where we would like to go. And finally, there is a strategy which the anti-sweatshop movement has not focused on over the last decade, and that is the fair trade approach, which I think it's fair to say is more carrot than stick. And we could talk about the political reasons why the anti-sweatshop movement has not pursued fair trade strategies in the past, but I think there's increasing interest in and focus on the fair trade concept in the anti-sweatshop movement. Now, as people may know, Transfair and other groups have been talking for the last 2 or 3 years about the idea of a fair trade standard for apparel, and we've been in dialogue with them and been talking to many other groups. And we've urged them to be very cautious, because apparel production is very different from production of agricultural commodities, including coffee. And there are a whole host of reasons why it's difficult to do it. We've been afraid that Transfair might come up with a standard that we would not view as a sufficiently strong standard. For example, there might be a standard that doesn't include living wage, which we feel is critical. We've been concerned about the model of verification, of certification, how it will be determined whether factories are or not in compliance. But nonetheless, the dialogue has been ongoing. And we at WRC, just in recent weeks, have begun to talk to universities about the idea of universities, not in their capacity as licensors of their logos, but in their capacity as retailers of their own logo apparel at their campus stores. We've been talking about the idea of university bookstores creating a fair trade market, a market for fair trade apparel. In other words, creating a market for goods made under good conditions for brands willing to sell that product to universities, and thereby creating a market from those brands to their suppliers for apparel made under decent conditions and decent wages. In other words, universities could, in their function as retailers, actually create a market for a product where no market currently exists. A market for apparel made under good working conditions and good wages, ultimately to be sold to the customers of university bookstores. And we can talk about why we think that might be a very effective strategy for moving things forward, notwithstanding the pitfalls and challenges of doing effective certification work. But one thing that is very clear to us after 7+ years of this work is that something more is required. Because until you solve this problem of price, and there are related issues, which I don't want to get into because time is short, that have to do with the structural relationship between the brands and retailers and their suppliers, but price is at the core of it. Until we solve this problem of price, there is a very low ceiling on what we can achieve in terms of broad sustainable improvements for workers. And so whatever it is, whether it is renewed, rejuvenated, more effective consumer pressure, whether it is universities ultimately adopting something like the Designated Suppliers Program and therefore using private regulation to achieve the goal, whether it is a fair trade approach, whether our elected leaders at some point in the foreseeable future actually take action publicly through public regulations, whatever it is, both narrowly in the context of university logo apparel and broadly in the context of global apparel manufacturing and global manufacturing in general, if we are going to see broad sustainable improvements, decent wages and conditions for workers, we will need to see something. I'll stop there. Thank you.
We have about 45 minutes for questions.
Okay. Sir, could you update us on what's happened for those in the audience who don't know? The University of Oregon, originally affiliated with the CIO sponsored organization, Free Trade, and then under pressure from Nike, they reversed, president of Oregon reversed his position, and I presume they are now part of that industry corporate side. They aren't?
No, they actually aren't. I mean, what happened, it's actually our organization that you're talking about, which is technically not AFL sponsored, just to correct it on a factual point. But clearly the labor movement was supportive of the creation of the Worker Rights Consortium. Very brief history, Oregon affiliated with the Worker Rights Consortium, and there was a very powerful backlash from Nike, because Phil Knight, at that time was the CEO of Nike, alumnus of the University of Oregon, had been a very generous donor, had a pending $30 million what do you call it, a grant, a donation that was going to be made to the University of Oregon, I think, to build a sports complex. And Phil essentially said he was very offended that the University of Oregon chose to do this. Now, I think if it happened today, there would be a very different reaction because the relationships involved are very different. But at the time, Nike very much viewed the whole effort around the WRC as an attack on them as a company. He said, I'm not going to give you this grant. And so that happened, and there was no immediate reaction from the University of Oregon, but I guess about a year to a year and a half later, they withdrew from the organization. And the official reason was that there's some sort of board, government entity in Oregon that regulates the functions of public educational institutions, and they issued a